Eva Boodman has been at Rowan since 2018, I believe. Am I correct?
2019.
2019. I see. I feel like it's been even longer. She is assistant professor of philosophy, has her PhD from SUNY Stony Brook, has a book entitled, if I take off my glasses I can actually read it, White Ignorance and Complicit Responsibility, Transforming Collective Harm Beyond the Punishment Paradigm, and has published a number of articles in areas of ethics, social, and political philosophy, including race, gender, and environmental thought, and carceral studies. Today, she is going to be presenting new work entitled Unsettling the Care Commons, and I'd like to ask all of you to help me welcome Dr. Boodman.
Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for being here, everyone in this room. I'm really happy to see some students and some friends here, and I will be very interested in your feedback since this is a work in progress. I may not get through the whole thing, but I'm going to try to get through most. And I am sorry in advance, but I'm going to read. But I will try to read in a dynamic fashion. So this talk is called Unsettling the Care Commons, and it's a chapter in progress for a collection called Rhetorics of Care. So if you're wondering why I'm talking about the way we think about care, it's because it's for a bigger project about rhetoric, which not even, what does that mean? Okay. So this is the summary that went around that I think will help you all understand, I hope, what I'm trying to do. So I'll just read this so we're all on the same page. The enclosure or privatization of the commons, which means collectively held land, communal labor practices, and collective ways of reproducing life through childcare, elder care, food production and preparation, education and healthcare, is widely associated with the advent of capitalism. In the current neoliberal age, that enclosure and extraction of our practices of care has made it difficult for most on the planet to meet their basic needs. For this reason, theorists like Silvia Federici have argued for a process of recommoning that gives regular people collective autonomy over meeting their basic needs. This paper is a first step in looking at what it means to recommon our practices of care in the face of their enclosure by corporations, NGOs, governments, and the market, rather than pinning down or reifying what should be a transitional and locally determined process. This paper looks at 4 zones of contradiction or threshold spaces that will arise in our attempts to establish a care commons. So if there's stuff in here that you didn't understand, I'm hoping that as I go, things will become clearer. So I'm going to give just a sort of brief introduction to the questions I'm trying to, I'm introducing a set of questions. So I'll just sort of explain why. This section is supposed to explain why. So this is called Getting Beyond the Liberated Enclave. Since the 1970s, we've seen the new enclosures gentrify, financialize, privatize, extract, and otherwise appropriate the bases and processes for generating life. As financial entities, NGOs, governments, and corporations take and capitalize on land, labor, bodies, and relationships, we're experiencing a crisis of social reproduction on a global scale. This crisis can also be understood as a crisis of care. As care, which some define as the activity of maintaining, containing, and repairing our world so that we can live in it as well as possible, becomes individualized and privatized under neoliberalism, many have turned to the rhetoric of the commons to imagine a world where needs are met through collective practices of sharing. In the global north, we see commoning practices like communal living, urban farming, community kitchens, and mutual aid meet some basic care needs, while sometimes also creating new communities and ways of relating that transcend and challenge capitalist modes of social, spatial, and economic organization. In this way, the idea of a care commons emphasizes that the commons is fundamentally about our practices of regenerating and sustaining life together. The fact that the commons is a moving target, which I'll talk about a little bit more, a process and not a thing, presents some real challenges for its theorization. Commoning is necessarily transitional, and you'll notice that commoning is a verb in the way I'm using it here. Since it's a set of practices, activities, and formations that means to transform our social relations beyond capitalism and the settler state. This means challenging imaginaries of commoning as the liberated enclave that, while it might prefigure a different mode of relating to land bodies and care for life, still reproduces enclosures by limiting who can belong. Liberated enclaves include intentional communities or co-ops that require a selective application process for participation or involve some exclusionary provision. In response to the failure of these exclusionary experiments in commoning to change our material conditions, Michelle O'Brien writes that the commoning processes must be welcoming to all, refusing both evaluation and homogenization. The commune must not be an institution based on shared affinity or similarity. Instead of restricting access to survival based on kin relations, fidelity, or identity, O'Brien describes the relationality of the care commons as providing, quote, each according to their need, the basic necessities of life to all without condition, end quote. This universal, open, and unenclosed vision of commoning means taking seriously our embeddedness in capitalism, settler colonialism, and neo-imperial entanglements as we attempt to care for one another. The liberated enclave leaves these background conditions unchanged, even if it might have pretensions, to be doing otherwise, and doesn't necessarily account for the ways that its creation relies on the benefits and enmeshments of finance, property, and state infrastructure. Rather than reject these enmeshments, I explore them here as a necessarily fraught beginning. Faced with the limitations of much utopian thinking about and small-scale practice of the commons, this chapter looks to unsettle the way we talk and think about a commons of care by discussing 4 areas of contradiction and enmeshment using Stavros Stavridis' theory of threshold spaces. That's a lot of theory. So the thresholds that I treat here are the neoliberal capture of collective care activities or reactionary care. The second one is the question of land and care commoning in settler societies. The third is basically the question of feminized labor. And so reproductive versus productive labor, and should we consider the labor of care as part of internal to production or an externality to production? And then the fourth, which I doubt I'll have time to get to, is the sort of contradiction of centering indigenous concepts and practices in our notions of care commoning, while recognizing that probably we're engaged in cognitive appropriation and extractivism as we do that. So some examples that I treat that we can talk later if you are interested in this part are things like buen vivir or buen convivir, or concepts that come from indigenous cultures that have been taken up by philosophers as a way to kind of inspire different ways of relating. Okay, so I treat each of these tensions not as aporias or paradoxes in the rhetoric of a care commons, but as axes of contestation that should be taken up as part of contemporary commoning practices themselves. Rather than a checklist or set of guidelines, my goal is to outline these political threshold spaces as questions that might help us imagine different context-specific possibilities as we practice co-creating our world. But before I talk about these 4 threshold spaces or zones of contestation, I'm going to make a quick case for the care commons as a thing, and then I'm going to give a definition of threshold spaces so that we know what that means. So here is, basically this is the structure of the project. So first, what's a care commons? The second one is, what do I mean by threshold spaces, which is not my idea, but I'm using it here. And then these are the 4 threshold spaces that I'm going to talk about. The case for a care commons. And I'm very interested in this right now in my research. Okay, so okay, the case for a care commons in the face of the new enclosures. On its traditional theorization, and I hope there are geography and environmental studies students in the room who learn about the tragedy of the commons, because I'm saying something really different here. So, okay. On its traditional theorization, the notion of the commons and its enclosure refers to the European process of privatization and propertification of lands held in common that occurred between the 13th and 19th centuries. Without access to land where the reproduction of life took place, that is, creating shelter, cultivating food, pasturing animals, growing and harvesting medicines, engaging in ritual and informal education, European peasants were forced to migrate to cities where their means of survival became the wage. These enclosures of the commons, by which open land and its associated ways of relating were seized by the state or the burgeoning capitalist class and incorporated into markets dominated by the transatlantic slave trade, cotton, sugar, and mercantilist relationships with the colonies, are widely seen as marking the advent of capitalism and the birth of the European proletariat. Contemporary theorists, however, have recognized the limitations of this Eurocentric narrative while retaining its analysis of production, reproduction, extraction, and accumulation. Taken in broader global perspective, the enclosure of the commons, both then and now, has involved originary accumulation, the colonial or imperial taking of resources, land, bodies, labor, plants, minerals, animals, for the purposes of generating profit. This means that we can understand the contemporary taking of land previously held in common at little or no cost by mining or bioenergy companies, NGOs like the World Bank, wealthy individuals or governments as enclosure. And this is what some theorists call the new enclosures. But enclosure extends beyond even this straightforward concept of originary accumulation to account for contemporary modes of reproducing life. The financialization and biocapitalization of the economy derive profit from our everyday modes of caring for ourselves and our loved ones, accumulating capital by surveilling and speculating on our internet and banking activity, by privatizing access to basic survival needs, and extracting from our bare life processes. Governments and corporate entities work together not only to enclose our means of reproducing life, water, shelter, food, land, education, care, stuff like that, but also our very attempts to resist that enclosure. Real estate developers capitalize on the community garden meant to address food injustice, displacing poor residents by enclosing their very efforts to survive in a food desert. Governments use mutual aid efforts as an excuse for cutbacks, or co-opt those efforts to prevent their radicalization and punish their delinking from flows of capital. Enclosure is, in this sense, both dispossessive and obstructive. As Stavros Stavridis, who's an architect and theorist of the commons, writes, quote, "The capitalist enclosure of the commons is not only a process of fencing in areas of production or the uses of certain goods and resources, but also a process of obstructing those commoning practices that tend towards an openness of sharing and cooperation," end quote. Indeed, our care practices and the relations by which we meet our care needs are subject to deep enclosure, with medical systems and care for aging or disabled bodies designed to generate profit for insurance companies and government entities through reimbursable acts. Capitalist institutions organized around care seek to extract from and co-opt, quote, autonomous forms of life into newer models of commodifiable care, working in tandem with the state to individualize and pacify a potentially militant, exploited public, end quote. That's by Care Notes Collective. Our very relations of dependency and interdependency, which define us as human beings and involve our most basic processes of being alive and staying alive, are the site of originary accumulation under contemporary capitalism. As Care Notes Collective writes, quote, "The perpetual and intensifying exploitation of working bodies and raw materials for profit are integral to capitalist life. Capitalist-driven crises through unemployment, deindustrialization, sexual violence, war, and other strategies have created bodies excluded from flows of capital. These are capital's disposable bodies. The other victims of capitalist violence, the workers, are assembled as the raw materials that are then worked upon by a variety of formations, i.e. NGOs, prisons, healthcare, the police, and religious institutions to ensure sustained production and profits," end quote. Under this very broad understanding of enclosure, the commons takes on a new set of meanings that refer to the ways that everyday people retake control over the reproduction of life. And not just, between the 13th and 19th century, like England privatizing land. So this is a broader understanding. According to Federici, And this is a quote that I put up here. The common, quite simply, is a particular way of organizing society. It is a particular way of conceiving relations among people and also relations to the means of production, relations to the land, relations to natural abundance, and to the wealth that we produce. It means a society where we have access to natural wealth, the wealth we produce, cooperation, and government from below, end quote. Because of the particular forms of enclosure that characterize capitalism right now, the process of recommoning is a process of recuperating our collective capacity to make decisions about our lives in resistance to the ways that we are disempowered by waged or underwaged work, the nuclear family structure, financial entities, extractivist healthcare, and state violence. It's a matter of building a society organized in a way that reproduces our life, sustaining our interdependent ways of living with and caring for one another, the land, and our bodies beyond individualism, profit, privatization, and property. The feminized labor of care is central to recommoning. As Federici puts it, collectively reproducing ourselves is the great terrain that sustains our life. It is also a terrain of struggle because all these activities are constantly being appropriated by the capitalist class. Care commoning, in other words, is the process by which we strive to gain collective autonomy over the material conditions by which our lives are reproduced. The relations by which we engage in domestic work and interdependency care, tend to land and nature for food and medicine, create and maintain shelter, raise and educate children, attend to bodily needs, and clean and process waste. Rhetorics of commoning and the commons, however, have not always focused on this reproductive dimension associated with the feminized work of care. In addition to their Eurocentricity, rhetorics of the commons have often taken their cue from Marx in assuming the backwardness of those who tend to land and engage with bodies and nature, denigrating peasant women as even more backward than men, even if this claim is belied by the fact that colonial forces around the world have looked to women and feminized workers to teach colonizers how to cultivate the land for survival. Historians and contemporary development theories place the feminized labor of reproducing life, care, outside of relations of production, even if omitting caring labor is not only an obstacle to understanding history, but, as Esther Kingston Mann shows, an impediment to the creation of successful development programs that might actually improve people's life chances. As Esther Kingston Mann shows, the process of enclosure is gendered, with women at the forefront of innovations both in working the land in common and in resisting top-down land reforms, followed by children, the disabled, and the elderly. Kingston Mann's study of women, the commons, and enclosure through land tenure transformation around the world shows that we cannot understand how the commons functions without understanding the fundamental role of care and feminized labor. As she writes, regardless of whether enclosure involves top-down communization, state appropriation, or privatization, it involves eliminating or radically undermining the land claims of women for a reason. Decommoning the feminized work of care invariably involves the destruction of village communities by eliminating processes of autonomous bottom-up decision-making about the shared reproduction of life. Because our systems of production depend on feminized reproductive labor while mystifying that dependence, any transition towards more autonomous modes of generating and regenerating life will necessarily happen through our practices of care, which are the basis for how societies are organized, whether that's admitted or not. This is the case that I'm making for a care commons. We can't resist enclosure and transform our modes of generating life without centering our practices of care. The transformation of our day-to-day processes of sustaining life is obviously not a linear or predictable process. If states are agents of enclosure, recommoning cannot take the form of top-down dictates or lists of requirements implemented by a coercive vanguard or set of institutions. Care commoning is both the process and the goal. It's the way we resist and the worlds that are sought and built through resistance. This means that even if the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism are global, each commoning process will have to navigate its own local intersection of enclosures from the ground up. Aside from their resisting privatization and state violence in favor of reclaiming autonomy over our material conditions and ensuring that life and living are sustained, commoning processes can't be generalized. In addition to this, the transitional nature of commoning means that it's a process that is, quote, shaped by social antagonism that often leads to historically contingent and ambiguous results, insofar as the process itself can fall prey to forms of enclosure, exclusion, or capitalist capture, meaning appropriation. That's a quote. Because commoning emerges from conditions where material needs are not being met, additional ambiguity may arise when, for example, people rely on state benefits programs or exchanges in the formal or informal money economy in order to survive. And this is obviously the case for all of us in this room, most of us, I assume. So, even so, political theorists Michael Hart and Antonio Negri theorize commoning as more than mutual aid that fills in the gaps created by austerity and markets that run on more and more of us becoming surplus. For them, commoning is a demand and practice of reorganizing social relations such that resources will be redistributed on a massive scale, enabling a transition beyond relations of extraction and deprivation. The fact that recommoning so that everyone's care and survival needs are met involves both a massive material transfer and an absence of coerced top-down dictates is its own productive tension, which, rather than being treated as an inconsistency, should be understood as part of the terrain of commoning. Even if commoning processes cannot be outlined in terms of generalizable principles, all commoning processes that seek to de-enclose our relations will necessarily involve this kind of transitional productive tension. For this reason, Stavrides associates commoning with threshold spatialities, which, as he writes, connect while separating and separate while connecting. As he writes, thresholds may appear as boundaries which separate an inside from an outside that transcend enclosure and open towards new commoners, which is a bit abstract. Because a care commons aspires to be a dissident politics in pursuit of collective emancipation, he writes, a set of practices and inventive imaginaries which explore the emancipatory potentialities of sharing. It involves multiple rhetorical and practical thresholds of this sort as mutable and open formations seek to transform material conditions of care through collaboration, reappropriation, and contestation. Commoning is a threshold spatiality in several different respects, both literal and rhetorical. Resisting enclosure through recommoning involves the ambivalence of dwelling on the threshold between separation and engagement with public entities and the state, the money economy, relations of production and productivism, access to land under conditions of settler colonialism, and the dynamics of using knowledge as a commons, even as those in the global north risk appropriating and defanging ideas by using them out of context. So these are the thresholds, the sort of points of tension that are the rest of the project. The productive tension of transitional thresholds applies just as much to rhetorics and idealizations of commoning formations as it does to our practices of commoning, to the imaginaries that guide our theory and practice. Our processes of care commoning, in other words, are a transitional process of de-enclosing not only our shared resources and processes, but our imaginations, as we build an economy, quote, with no capitalism, where the starting point is capitalism. And that's a quote from Amaya Perez Orozco, who I'm gonna cite a fair bit in the sections of this paper, who wrote a book called The Feminist Subversion of the Economy. So let's talk about the first zone of contestation, and that is what I'm calling reactionary care or neoliberal capture. As we undertake this project of transition, we will have to contend with an area of contradiction that Amaya Perez Orozco calls reactionary care, which she construes as a kind of neoliberal capture of commoning processes. This threshold space at work in commoning processes is the ongoing risk that care commoning projects will enable austerity, even as they resist it, by filling the gaps of the state and market abandonment. This is why the now Dziennikai, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, the NCC, Commons Collective from Lithuania, has written that, and this is a quote I have up here, the autonomy of the commons cannot be based on a simple secession from the state and the market. This would only offer a favor to capital, which can now shed the costs of spatial maintenance and social reproduction onto us. The question of autonomy thus becomes a matter of strategic dependency, of inhabiting and navigating the problem of transitioning beyond the market and the state. Under current conditions, care is necessarily imbricated with the market and the state, even as it takes forms that are resistant to them. Reactionary care, as Perez Orozco writes, is the ambivalent dimension of commoning projects where communities, household, and unpaid work function as a cushion to soften the impact of a system that attacks life. Here, the system is, as she writes, the market-state household configuration originating in Euro-America and exported everywhere else, where the welfare state and the household's sexual division of labor function to mediate the conflict between capital and life, sharpening or reducing the conflict in various ways, but never eliminating it. On Perez Orozco's account, mutual aid projects and increased levels of reproductive labor undertaken by feminized people are reactionary insofar as they are survival tactics in response to economic conditions of extraction and abandonment that operate within the state market household paradigm. Projects of recommoning will, to various degrees and in their own ways, operate on this liminal threshold, which Perez Orozco describes as the invisible hand of everyday life, which resolves problems caused by the invisible hand of the market, or at least mediates their impact. Care work and feminized or reproductive labor are a kind of shadow, invisible hand, since care work is an ambiguous space thought to be outside of capital, while at the same time being a site of originary accumulation necessary for the existence of capital in the first place. More on that later, if we have time. But more than passively perpetuating the operation of a system that attacks life, reactionary care, while allowing many to survive, also creates conditions for a broader shift in governments that could be called the new enclosures. The Naujininkai Commons Collective characterized this liminality in contemporary urban commoning processes as a form of capture, or what they call capital's social fix, for our current crisis of care. It is, according to them, a move from the ad hoc approaches of creative revitalization of the previous era to their generalization in the present as a systemic urban development strategy. So basically what they mean, there's a longer quote here, but I'll just say, the example of the community garden that initially was created to address food injustice, then being used to advertise new artist lofts or some, like housing development for wealthier people, is an example of this, of the new enclosures. So there's enclosure of resistance to enclosures. So there's an attempt at recommoning, namely like the community garden that doesn't own its own land. And then the community garden becomes its own form of capital that's enclosed by developers and capitalists. So this is not just the new enclosures, but the new enclosures. And this is characteristic of the era that we're in now. And so in this situation, there's no unambiguous approach to take. We can't directly just take the vacant lot and grow the stuff. We have to be aware of the fact that this is always going to risk neoliberal capture by developers, by governments, by NGOs, for the sake of profit, for the sake of, that isn't going to be in the interests of the people who live in that neighborhood who maybe decided to do that project in the first place. So that's why, for the NCC, such conditions of liminality with respect to capitalist and state capture call for equally liminal solutions, like public commons partnerships, which they construe as a kind of reparations in the face of enclosure, which this involves the state. So these are anarchists who are like, we need public commons partnerships, which they construe as a kind of reparations in the face of enclosure. For them, public commons partnerships, which harness and take advantage of state capture, are a, quote, transitory tool allowing for direct democratic control over the distribution of value without relying on privatization, nor upon the nationalization and centralization of the infrastructures and enterprises seized. They argue that this is an effective, if ambivalent, mechanism for building the economic autonomy that would, quote, enunciate the horizon for a fully communist transformation of the capitalist political economy. So that's very ambitious. But it's very interesting. This is really a threshold zone that's being recommended. So some examples of this include, municipal support for bylaws that would allow community gardens to remain public spaces, or something like squatters' rights to be enshrined in zoning ordinances. So that involves the state, but it's a public commons partnership. or allocating state money to horizontally operated mutual aid projects that both serve people in need and shift decision-making processes for resources and time. These are the sorts of things that this group has in mind and that they're actually practicing in Lithuania. These are threshold spaces insofar as they transform valorization and governance processes through our ways of sustaining life, even as each of these remains subject to enclosure and neoliberal capture. So there's no pure escape from the enclosure of our bodies, minds, and relations. But, as Perez Orozco writes, our commoning processes can nonetheless create spaces for collectively sustaining life where it can overflow its commodified dimension. So the second threshold space has to do with the question of land and settlement. The question of land, access, and belonging to it, whether it's owned, unowned, or held in trust, and what role the state or nations have in managing or stewarding land, and most crucially, how and whether processes of recommoning can contend with the fact of settler colonialism, is an unavoidable threshold dimension of a care commons process. While theories of care might not always center land and territory, care is associated with generating, regenerating, and sustaining life, of co-responsibility for a collective life under conditions of interdependence and eco-dependence. And those are terms that I take from Colectiva XXK. They're like based in Spain and Mexico. Okay. A care commons must take land into account since conditions of uncare, lack of access to food, water, community, health, and ancestral and spiritual connections to land, soil, and ecosystems are tied to the enclosure of land and the relationships sustained by it. The enclosure process has always been colonial insofar as it appropriates land and indigenous relationships to land as resources for originary accumulation. This is true for the colonization of the Americas as much as it is true for contemporary land grabs in Asia, Central and South America, and on the African continent, which displace those dependent on that land through privatization or corporate land despoliation, prompting mass migrations to centers of accumulation in the global north. These migrants, along with settlers and Aravans, are necessarily participants in a generalized collective enclosure of indigenous lands and relations, and any effort to reclaim our means of reproducing life will need to face this contradiction, and there's like no great, like, obvious solution to that. It just is. Adjusting our rhetorics of commoning is crucial here, given their Eurocentric bias and a tendency on the left to deprioritize the problem of settlement relative to the question of class struggle. As Craig Fortier writes in Unsettling the Commons, if we consider settler colonialism and neocolonialism as ongoing structures, then, quote, it becomes important to think about the multiple ways in which the desire to reclaim the commons, even a global commons, can be embedded within the logics of indigenous dispossession and elimination, end quote. The entanglement of the commons with enclosure is not new. As Fortier documents, regimes of property, even in early settlement, involved not an opposition between the commons and enclosure, but an interplay between the two. Interestingly, common property was a central feature of both native and settler forms of land tenure in the early colonial period, and dispossession came about largely through the clash of an indigenous commons and a colonial commons. What Fortier describes as the codependence of regimes of property in the commons speaks to the threshold aspect of commoning, since it makes clear that commoning has long-standing potential not just as a form of resistance to enclosure, but as a tool of settler accumulation. This is true of utopian theories that tend to romanticize the collective aspects of the commons to the neglect and exclusive nature of most commons known to history, and of the tendency to suggest that Eurocentric conceptions of the commons and those of indigenous people in North America are complementary, equitable, or even synonymous. Fortier thus theorizes the commons as plural rather than singular, and as a terrain of ambiguity, insofar as it can be a site of evasion of settlement and settler responsibility, naturalization of settlement, and appropriation of land and relations to land. In this way, matters of land, settlement, and unsettling are thresholds inherent to the practice of commoning or recommoning. As Fortier puts it, any process of commoning will involve the double bind of being made by but also trying to surpass colonized subjectivity. So the last two sections, just to give you a sense of where this is going. Section 3 is the sort of ambivalence of feminist economics. Like, if we're trying to get beyond productivism, is a care commons do we conceive of that as within our relations of production? Are we internalizing something that's an externality? Or are we rethinking what we mean by the economy altogether? So this is a lot, but Perez Orozco, who I've been citing, basically is trying to trouble the distinction that we make between productive labor, so like making stuff, and reproductive labor, the care and the feminized labor that remakes the worker so that they can go back to work every day. So like caring labors, feminized labor, the work of growing food, taking care of kids, educating, all that stuff is reproductive labor. So she wants to not have a binary distinction between those things and to sort of question the whole relationship. She wants to ask questions about production. That's why she says production does not exist. And then what she recommends instead is buen convivir. So a sort of concept of relationality, a relational concept that gets beyond productivism. But then that risks kind of appropriating indigenous concepts in ways that are detached from, those cultures. And that's its other zone of contradiction or contestation. And that's the talk. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, so this is all new to me. I'm a business major, and I'm still kind of confused on what exactly this is. So if you could just like re-explain it in simpler terms.
Sure. Any part in particular or the whole thing?
Just like the commons or
Okay.
the main point, like what you're trying to go after, I guess.
Yes. So the commons, so have you heard of something called the tragedy of the commons?
Yes.
Okay. So the tragedy of the commons is this idea that when people share, they'll always get in trouble, unless they have a big disciplinarian telling them not to share, and telling them not to take more than their share. And so the idea is we need a state with laws that limit what people do. But this is sort of a misunderstanding of why we don't have the commons. The reason we don't have the commons is not because everybody clobbered each other. The reason we don't have a commons is that new formations in Britain, like new economic formations, like ways of doing business that included, getting cotton from that was being cultivated and picked by people who were enslaved in the United States, and then like brought over to Europe to then be processed. So basically, colonization happened. Colonization and the advent of capitalism happened around the same time, and the enclosure of commonly held land, shared land, also happened around that time. So all these things are happening, over the period of a few hundred years. And when we talk about the enclosure of the commons, what we mean is there was land that wasn't owned by anybody under feudalism, basically that era, that was used by peasants to feed themselves, do ritual, have meetings, grow medicine that they needed. And in Britain, that land was privatized. And so people then had nowhere to go. They didn't have a place to grow their food, to pasture their animals. And so they had no choice but to go to the cities and work in factories where they were, what's the word I'm looking for? Processing natural resources that were taken from colonized places, including the United States. So we have this global set of relationships, and part of those relationships is taking away shared land that wasn't private property and making it into private property. And the result of that was then people had to rely on like being exploited in other ways. So the idea of recommoning is the idea that it might be better for how we take care of ourselves and meet our basic needs to have shared spaces again. Shared ways of, I say generating life, but I mean like literally feeding ourselves, housing ourselves, getting clean water, taking care of ourselves in the most basic ways, which I think it's hard to, in this room, it's like hard to wrap our minds around, but like most of the world can't do that. And one explanation is that, the tragedy of the commons is like, oh, those places with too big populations because they're morally bad, like can't manage themselves. And so they need, external people to teach them how to be humans. And this says, actually, no. Those places are not doing well because private property was introduced by colonizing powers that took away their land, took away their means of survival. And so then people became extremely poor and couldn't meet their basic needs and had trouble surviving. So what would it take to reverse that set of relations or change that set of relations so that we had shared ways of taking care of our basic needs? Not just over there, but here too. So that's the basic premise that I'm trying to talk about is like, okay, the commons is like this old concept, but it's also like we use it in everyday speech. Like you drive down like 55 or whatever, and then, or you drive through some township in New Jersey, and you'll see something called the Commons, and it's like some housing development. So enclosure means like when capitalists looking to make money, take something that wasn't privately owned and then make money off of it, and the concept of the commons is even enclosed in that way. So now the commons is like, we think of like the digital commons, or like, a college quad, which like is not really the commons because it's like, that's a private space. It's not a public space accessible to anybody for sharing. And it's also, universities, while there's lots of ways that we share and there are sort of like things that are sort of like third spaces where we can gather, we're not sharing in the process of meeting our basic needs together. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, so the point of the talk is to be like, there's no one answer about how to do that. Basically, all I have are questions. And they're, so welcome to philosophy. So I don't have an answer for what that looks like. However, I'm going to talk about 4 questions that might be a good place to start. So that's basically, in normal language, what I'm trying to do.
I'm going to take a question from the virtual audience, which just came in, and I'm going to read it to you, and you can look at me as I do this. Professor Wong asks, can Eva explain a little more about the challenge of to the concept of production? Does it involve subversion of production/destruction? You got that? You want me to read it again?
Subversion of destruction?
Subversion of production/destruction. Like, so the whole, right, the...
Oh yeah, production does not
like
exist.
The opposition between the two?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll do my best here. The tension here is, okay, I'm gonna give an example that I think might help answer this question, which is the wages for housework movement. So wages for housework basically was like, no production can happen without women's labor. If you don't have women at home doing laundry, washing the dishes, taking care of kids, and changing diapers, and mopping the floors, and sometimes getting groceries, I understand that men also do this stuff. But this is what's called feminized labor. So work that's traditionally associated with women and people who are feminized. So without that work, we would have no production. So we would have no workers. We would have, so that's an old school definition of productive labor, which is like the labor of going to the factory and producing the goods that then are sold for then that company to make the profit. Feminized labor and reproductive labor is the shadow world of unrecognized work that it's reproductive because it's literal mothers producing babies that will then enter the market to make money, but they're also reproducing workers from day to day. So, you can't have somebody go back to the factory unless they have dinner waiting for them at home so that they can be alive the next day, and the next week, and the next month, and the next year to be workers in the factory, to then bring home their wage so that the wife can get the food. Obviously, gender relations are not exactly this way anymore, but this is to describe productive versus reproductive labor. And I think the question, what was the question? It was like, can I say more about...
And whether it involved a kind of move at, the production destruction binary as well. Does that make sense?
What's the production destruction binary?
That was just, I can.
Referring to the crossed out production?
No, I think more just in other words, was it production reproduction is one distinction? Is this other distinction also involved in this at all?
No, I don't know anything about the production destruction distinction. What I do know is that the wages for housework contradiction is the thing I'm looking for. Wages for housework says we should pay people to change diapers, do groceries, and mop the floor. If we did that, our entire economy would collapse. Capitalism would die if we started doing that. Just look at who is changing old people's diapers and how much we pay them. So lately, I saw something on social media that was an SEIU, the union. There were a bunch of aides who were on strike, and there was an image of an aide who had a sign that said, "Would you wipe my butt for $15?" And I think that says everything about this, where no, we don't want to pay people more than $15 an hour, and many people actually can't afford to do that. But if people were actually being paid for the condition for our relations of production, the economy would collapse. Like if we were paying migrants who are doing dirty work an actual living wage, our economies would collapse. Why do you think that it's so hard to get people, even $15 an hour is not enough for people to live in the current economy. But at the same time, if we're trying to get beyond productivism and exploitation, why are we asking to be paid money for childcare? So we're commodifying this labor, even as we're trying to eliminate relations where we commodify each other and we commodify care. So I think that's the contradiction. So that's the production-reproduction binary, which Perez Orozco was like, we should be destabilizing this whole categorization of labor. There's this problem of getting beyond a system where feminized labor is sort of locked into being this shadow realm of production. But actually what we need is a different way of relating to life that isn't productivist at all, that isn't commodifying at all. How do we get there? Well, it's going to involve a lot of ambiguity. And we need a completely different way of meeting our basic needs. And she then looks to these concepts like buen convivir, which I'm kind of like, that's fine, but even that concept is used by governments in Central America and Latin America. It's not outside the realm of states and markets and stuff like that. So that's also, as I said, I only have questions here. Disappointingly, perhaps.
So thank you so much for this. It was really interesting, so I appreciate it. So I guess my question, I might be misunderstanding the idea of a commons a little bit, but if the idea is that we're going to have this common space to meet our basic needs, I guess very simply, I'm wondering about what is going to happen to the people who kind of don't want to do it that way. Because I'm thinking of a lot of times what will happen is with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, they might be very good candidates for safe housing. But then they'll turn it down because it's a communal living environment. There's there's a whole bunch of other families there. I don't want to do that, right? And so I'm kind of worried about, is the commons going to sort of run into that problem where people are like, I don't know if I really want to be meeting my basic needs in this way. I want to have my private space, right. And so what's going to happen there?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't have a great answer. I think this is just, I think I said this at the beginning of the talk, but I think there is this tension between, recommoning needing to involve autonomy for individuals and for local groups of people and not involve top-down coercion because we see what happens. On the other hand, if there's going to be a redistribution of resources, what does that look like? And I really don't know. I'm interested in that, but I feel like I don't have an answer. And I think my best answer is to say, this is why commoning is not like a sort of generalizable principle or theory of governance. It's a set of practices that are undertaken on a local level And so I'm not that interested in saying like recommoning is basically like communization at the state level where we have a communist state, and like that seems not right. That's sort of not what I'm looking for. I'm more like, what theoretical tools do we have as more and more of us don't have what we need to do that together? And what are the tensions that are going to come up? And that's certainly one of them. Like, how do we get beyond these liberated enclaves where it's like basically a leftist gated community? You know what I mean? Or like a hippie commune, even though some of those gatherings are very welcoming to all kinds of weirdos and people who struggle and addicts and, you know, so I think, and I didn't include this in the talk, but in my reading, people who think about this stuff were like, well, maybe, you know, collective living situations in communes are not the model we're looking at. We're looking at barricades and encampments. So more and more of us are not going to be able to meet our basic needs. And so this isn't going to be like, oh, I prefer to not work with other people. We're going to have to, because we're not going to have water. And you know, climate change is going to ruin our food supply. Our supply chains are going to break down. This is very apocalyptic, I know. But there are places, most places in the world already are living under these conditions. And so, you know, the examples that I read Michelle O'Brien's work, and she's like very interested in communization theory. And the examples she gave were like barricades in Oaxaca and places where people are facing a kind of scarcity that requires collaboration for survival. And people who don't want to participate, that's okay. You know, perhaps they're figuring something else out. But this isn't, I'm not proposing a top-down theory of the state or of governance. I'm more sort of exploring contradictions exactly like the one you raised for groups of people who are like, how do we do this in a way that's not exclusionary? How do we meet needs together? What are problems that are going to come up? And, you know, it's not just these four things. I mean, I feel like the tensions and problems and questions abound, and the answers are really not easy, which is why I feel like it's very fertile ground to have these conversations.
Virtual question. How can we begin to return to the basic needs when we live in a fast-paced world with electronics? So.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I think that I like the perspective that says, well, what kind of conditions are being created for people who create the electronics? And are things accelerating equally for all people in the same manner? And is that being lived in the same way for everyone in the world? The answer is no. So I don't know. And part of me is like, am I wrong that, like, part of me feels like it can't keep going this way, like things are going to collapse. But I could be wrong. So I'm just speculating here. And, you know, I think I should come clean that part of the motivation for this is I'm like, it wouldn't take that much for all of this to just stop working. And then we would have to figure out how to feed ourselves in ways that didn't involve, you know, like ordering stuff with apps.
I remember you brought up the example of like, I think you were talking about like anarchists working with the state in some way, like community gardens to like avoid like enclosure. And so I think that's very interesting. So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about that, because my immediate mindset is like, if you are like an anarchist and you're like, you know, against the whole idea of a state, how is working with the state beneficial, and wouldn't that just, you know, constitute another form of enclosure by working with them?
Yes, totally. So I think that in theory, it's fine to, I think it's a choice to, obviously I can't speak for all anarchists or forms of anarchism, but I think if we're talking about shifting material conditions on the ground and contending with the fact that even anarchists who choose not to engage with the state at all will risk seeing some form of capture happen to their efforts, whether they like that or not. One option for dealing with that, which may not apply in every situation, is using the apparatus of the state, even though that's a risk. So it's accepting the risk of that. And I think in a way, it's like, it isn't throwing principles out the window, but it's taking them down to a sort of more material and strategic level. And like, as that group says, they call it strategic dependence, where they're like, the state has resources because it extracted resources. So this is reparations, actually. If we get the state to fund and to introduce laws that protect this as a common space, and to use the state's resources, we're getting something back from the state that it took away. I mean, that's not exactly how they say it, but they do frame it as reparations. And I think one case that I'm thinking of is, so I've been connected with this urban gardening project in Philly, and they're using the municipal government to protect land that was foreclosed on, that then was appropriated by a bank, to put it in trust. And there are problems with the trust. Like, it's not a perfect solution, but it involves cooperating with the municipal government, with the city government, actually, and following certain ordinances and filing some paperwork. And also there are like timelines and things they need to do and ways it needs to look. So they can't just like rewild it or like do whatever they want. But it means that it's not going to be bought by a developer. On the other hand, another lot might be bought by a developer, and having that garden looking nice, following all the ordinances, is going to look really great to some bougier people who might want to live in a neighborhood that, is not as expensive yet as other neighborhoods, and then it'll be gentrified. So I think I would love for there to be a path that's like a purist solution. And I think if I'm making an argument, it's that I don't think there is one, and but there are choices to make about enmeshment. And one of them is to say, I'm not going to collaborate with any state agencies. And that's still its own kind of risk. But I think it's just good to kind of have a framework that acknowledges that even if you're not engaging with the state or negotiating with the state or doing paperwork with the state, there still may be risk of state capture in some other way. So it's a matter of making some informed and strategic choices about how that relationship is going to work. But there's more to say, but I hope that answered your question, at least for now.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, this might be kind of a long-winded question, so bear with me. But
just make sure that it's loud to hear all the way on the front.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I've been told I have a tendency to talk kind of quietly. So with this, like, strategic dependence on the state and the concept of the commons being something that we can, like, use as a shared space, how do you, like, maintain that sort of, like, larger conceptual view of the commons? Because, like, when I think of the state protecting a piece of land, like a piece of nature, I think of that then becoming something that we see as, like, pristine and something that we can't touch, and, like, this, like, created concept of nature that then is, like, kind of separate from us. So how does that fit into the commons? Did that make sense?
I think so. Tell me if this is what you mean. Like, that when we're asking for that kind of state support, it's preservationist and it presupposes a certain idea of what nature is or what nature means. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and then I would see that then as, like, different than what the concept of the commons is.
Because the concept of the commons is land that's used.
Yeah.
I think in some cases that might be true if it's a preservationist project that has those sorts of limitations. But to me, it seems like it really depends on what kind of agency and what kind of policy and because there are some projects that are explicitly conservationist or preservationist, and they're undertaken for that reason without any claims about what's pristine or not pristine or really truly nature or not really truly nature. So without getting into that whole debate, I think strategic dependency on state processes, they can look lots of different ways. And I think the idea is to understand them and use them to the benefit of the communal regeneration of life. So does this policy or ordinance foster the collective reproduction of life? Or does it limit it? Or does it foster it in some ways and limit it in other ways? So if there's a policy to protect a certain tract of land that means that it could still be used by groups of people for foraging, let's say, then that doesn't presuppose any definitions of nature. So I think it's a matter of really being like, what can people do together on this piece of land, and how does this law or ordinance or thing help us do that or inhibit us from doing that? I think that's the sort of strategy here. And I actually think that that's one way of being an anarchist, is to be like, instead of having these highfalutin ideas about like this grandiose picture of society, being like, what can we do right now to improve conditions? Like, how do we get so-and-so out of jail? How do we get so-and-so food? Where is their surplus, and how can we take that and give it to the people who need it now? Even though that's not the only, obviously there are many theories and many interpretations of like how to be an anarchist, but I don't think that all of them are necessarily say we have to never engage with the state or state benefits or state agencies in any way. I think there is a sort of scrappy form, messy approach or ethos, anarchist ethos, that says we're going to do what we need to do within reason to get needs met. And we will take resources from the state when we can do that in a way that's not going to totally compromise what's happening, and that is strategic from the point of view of our commitments. I'm not saying I endorse this, but I am saying that this is one way that a group of people very far away from here in Lithuania navigated that particular tension. So I don't know, we can talk more later. I don't know if that answered your question.
2 seconds to
This has been terrific, thank you. So this is a little bit of a follow-up on the question from over there and my business college colleague over here. Going back to threshold 1, so you had an example of a state commons collaboration. Do you have an example, and I know you said you don't have examples, you've got questions, but do you have an example of an industry commons collaboration?
I know that many of those exist.
Okay.
An industry commons collaboration. I imagine that there are many environmental initiatives where there's like private money. There's a community initiative and then there's private money that is involved, and maybe some kind of, I don't know. I don't have any examples that are coming to mind, but I think if I sat down and thought about it, I could certainly come up with examples. In the literature, I think there's some reticence to engage in sort of industry or corporate collaboration because a lot of this theory is anti-capitalist. And so if this is about profit making and the idea that, any commoning project would then be enclosed and some industry would benefit from it. At the same time, if you ever participate in anything like that, if a group with resources says we want to help and we're going to give you this stuff, I think there are questions to ask about that, because in a way it's like, who gets to keep their hands 100% clean? But I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, and I think it really sort of, but certainly with the books that went into this presentation were more interested in public commons partnerships than in industry commons partnerships, even though I bet we could find some for sure.
So I'm going to ask everyone to join me in thanking Igor one last time.